so for the intersecting seams, the book tells you to cut out 20 squares that you're going to piece together.
Yeah.
5 squares in one row, and so you'll have 4
Make them together?
rows. Yes, you're going to put them together. So you'll put right sides together, and you'll start here, you'll backstitch, you'll sew, and you'll backstitch. Half inch will work. And then once you're done, after it's sewn, it gets pressed open. And then you sew this guy as well, and so on. So you'll have 4 rows, which is like, there's, here, when you're done, you'll basically have 4 rows. Then we're gonna sew row 1 to row 2. And we'll sew row 3 to row 4. And this is where you have 2 different techniques, because when you sew row 1 to row 2, you're gonna have to line up your seam lines. That's called intersecting seams. They intersect, you want them to line up, okay? And there's 2 ways to get them to line up. So this first way, well, we'll do this one. This is the first way. You put right sides together, make sure you pin it so that they are definitely lined up, the seams. Start, sew, backstitch, sew, and this time they sew right over the seam allowance, making sure your seam allowance is pressed flat, okay? The second method, again, this is from the book where they talk about you can stitch with the seam allowances stitched down, or you can stitch with the seam allowances left free. So you have to move the seam allowances, stop sewing, flip the seam allowances to continue sewing. This was the first example, sewing with the seam allowances stitched down. The second one, she put right sides together, she pinned so that her seams are matching, backstitch, sewed, 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 moved the seam allowance to one side, and stopped sewing right there at the seam. Then she took out her stitch and moved her, took it out from the needle, moved the seam allowance to the other side, started back up in the same spot. Backstitch, sew, 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 make sure the seam allowance is to the side, stop when you get to the next intersecting seam, backstitch, take it out of the machine, move the seam allowance to the other side, start again, backstitch. So that way when she sewed it, the seam allowances of the intersecting seams are free. Okay, so those are just the 2 different methods the book talks about to join your seams.